As I was watching Legend of the Galactic Heroes, a quote that really kept resonating in my head was from Oliver Stone's 1995 film Nixon, wherein Mao Zedong is talking to Nixon and he says, "The real war is within us. History is a symptom of our disease." Which is a very cynical but not inaccurate way to describe great men. You have these figures in history, your Mao Zedongs, your Napoleons, your Alexander the Greats, your Julius Caesars. And more than anything else, it's their actions and their insecurities and their struggles that shape the way that the world is. Now, I'm going to warn you right now, massive spoilers. We're going to go through all the spoilers in this video. So if you don't care about that, that's fine, but just giving you a warning. So, Reinhard von Lohengramm is one of the most celebrated and iconic characters in all of anime. Even if you haven't seen or heard of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, you probably come across him, either semi-seriously because people really like the imperial aesthetic, or as part of a meme because he sometimes has funny facial expressions and there's his genuine feminine appearance. Legend of the Galactic Heroes is often brought up in debates about the greatest anime of all time. While nearly every aspect of this series is excellent, many fans point to the characters of Reinhardt and Yang and the ideological and personal conflict between them as the emotional and philosophical core of the show. And I would tend to agree with that. Despite spending well over 100 episodes exploring Reinhardt's life and rise to power, by the end of the series, he retains a deeply enigmatic quality. Even after the final episode rolls, we're left wondering to ourselves, who was the real Reinhardt? Contrast this with Yang, who, while complex, has a very coherent and straightforward moral and emotional core. I think Yang is a character you can know, and you can know what makes him tick and know kind of what the fundamentals are that make him up, whereas with Reinhardt, I find it very difficult to exactly pin him down. As I mentioned in other videos, Citizen Kane taught me something that applies here, especially to great men. You can know every major event in a person's life and still feel as though you never truly knew them. Reinhardt, I think, fits this mold perfectly. Like I said, we're with him for 110 episodes, several movies, and a prequel series. And to a certain extent, he's just as mysterious to me by the time the series ends as when it started. So, before we get into Reinhardt's life, we need to talk about the great man of history theory. So this is a theory that proposes that history is primarily driven by the actions of exceptional individuals, those people with unique genius, charisma, or leadership. These great men are seen as shaping historical events through personal will and decisive choices, especially in the times of crisis. There's often a mystical or ordained element to the theory that these individuals are raised up by God or destiny to change the world. And they often believe that themselves, and that's one of their key driving forces. And that their abilities are almost supernatural. Their intelligence, their charisma, their insight. It seems like there's just something about them that makes them qualitatively different from normal people. And beyond that, like I said regarding destiny, they happen to be the right person in the right place at the right time. So this theory was popularized by Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, who famously claimed the history of our world is but the biography of great men. So that might be a little extreme for some people, but there is a more moderate version of it, which says that individual action does matter, that the people who make up history impact history, that it's not solely due to economic, social, environmental factors, but there is a degree of freedom involved with it and personal choice, and the values of the people who make history are also important. So I went through and I made kind of a list of some great men of history. Now, the reason I picked these was I wanted to stress that they don't necessarily have to be a statesman or a military conqueror. And the term great doesn't necessarily mean good or positive, it just means they had a major impact. So obviously in the past we have Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, those are kind of the archetypes. I would also count Confucius and Plato because they're debatably the most important philosophers who ever lived. And if that isn't altering the course of history, I don't know what is. And then we head into the medieval era, and we have Genghis Khan. We have Johann Gutenberg, who I think is very important with his invention of the printing press, which dramatically changed the world, even if he wasn't a ruler or a conqueror. And then I threw in Mehmed II, who took Constantinople, and William Shakespeare. Now, obviously, he's a playwright, but he invented a lot of the modern English language, and a lot of the idioms we use to this day come from him. And then I just kind of went through and I picked some other ones. Isaac Newton discovered the theory of gravity. Martin Luther, Thomas Edison with the light bulb. Now, obviously, he had a production team working with him, but the discovery of reliable electric light dramatically changed the world. And then just kind of as a little joke, I included Steve Jobs, but he did change the mobile electronics industry. Even if he didn't invent the stuff, it was his vision that kind of propelled a lot of changes that led to modern smartphones. So let's start talking about Reinhardt. So Reinhard von Lohengramm was born on March 14th, Universal Century 776, to the impoverished aristocratic von Musel family, who lived in a middle-class suburban neighborhood on the imperial capital planet Odin. His mother died in a car accident and his father was an alcoholic. Just as a side note, sometimes this was a rough place to be because there are certain jobs that are considered beneath the nobility, perhaps commerce or a skilled trade was deemed too low for a noble to do. So if they were poor and they didn't have any money and they didn't have an estate, they couldn't really take the out that would normally be available to a middle-class person. So this is interesting, and we're going to go through a lot of parallels between Reinhardt and great men of history, and how I think he really kind of encapsulates a lot of traits of them. So historically, many revolutionaries or reformers emerged from the middle or lower nobility, or from the middle class for that matter. A whole bunch of them have been lawyers. And there's a reason for this. Most revolutionaries tend to come from the middle or upper middle class because those are the people who have the time, education, effort to really care about things like ideology, to really think about how they want the world to be, and who have the resources and frankly the time to like organize and to start working on these things. They also have a very clear goal in mind, and they have a very clear motivation in that if they overthrow the current order, they can become the new ruling class and get all the spoils that come with it. In 1984, the group in society that is the most heavily oppressed is the outer party, or what remains of the middle class, because they're really the only place that revolution can come from. As the proles don't really care so long as they're happy, and the inner party obviously has no reason to overthrow the government. So just to kind of list some other people from the same, Napoleon was from a poor Corsican noble family. Tokugawa Ieyasu, despite being a Miyamoto, I believe his original domain was very small. Julius Caesar came from a patrician family, but it was very poor at the time he started to make his career. Hero II is a private citizen who came to power as the despot of Syracuse. And the great conqueror Timur was a chieftain or a noble from a relatively less powerful tribe. Point being, these people were not the bottom of the social hierarchy, but they definitely had a bone to pick. The two people who really defined Reinhardt's early life, and indeed the rest of his life, were his older sister Annerose and his childhood friend Siegfried Kircheis, who swore loyalty to him and became his brother in all but name. Reinhardt always called him Kircheis because believing Siegfried was too ordinary a name for someone so exceptional. So of everybody in the world, Kircheis was probably the closest person to Reinhardt, and if anyone was said to truly know him and to know where he came from, what his ambitions were, and who he was as a person, it would be him. And while Reinhardt loved him dearly, and saw him basically as his brother, and probably hoped at some point that he would marry his sister and become his literal brother, the relationship was never equal. Kircheis always served Reinhardt. He was always the junior partner in the friendship. And it was always understood that Reinhardt was the idea guy. He had the big plans. He had the big goals to change the universe. And Kircheis would be the one to support him in all of that. So once again, referencing Citizen Kane at the ending with Rosebud, this period may have been the only time in Reinhardt's life where he was genuinely happy. It's something that he would remember constantly whenever he felt down or was stressed out for the remainder of his life. He carried a locket that he would often play with whenever he was getting nervous or agitated that contained a picture of Annerose, Kircheis, and himself, along with a lock of Kircheis' hair, which is a little creepy, but it was a memento after he dies relatively early in the series. So it can be said, like I said, that they were the only people who truly knew him. And after Kircheis died and Annerose kind of abandoned him and went into retirement, I don't think he was ever whole again. I think his fundamental ability to relate to other people was destroyed in a way that I don't think he ever really regained. So, childhood's end. Annerose, much like her brother, was exceedingly beautiful, and it captured the attention of a high noble who wanted to present her as a gift to the Kaiser. So he purchased her from Reinhardt's father, and Reinhardt was obviously really angry about this. His father just said, look, it was either I take a bunch of money and give her over, or they're just going to take her, and we're poor, so we need the money. So because Annerose is Annerose, she quickly became the favorite concubine of the Kaiser. And this made Reinhardt very angry. He loved his sister. His sister was kind of like a sister and a mother figure to him. And like I said, he is one of the only two people who he unconditionally loved. So Reinhardt, just combined with that, the arbitrariness of taking his sister away, his family's position in the world, how corrupt and decadent the aristocracy was. Along with Kircheis, they swore an oath before a statue of Rudolf von Goldenbaum, who founded the current Galactic Empire, that they were going to overthrow the corrupt order, that Reinhardt was going to seize power, he was going to use his will alone to alter the course of history, to sweep away the current broken system and replace it with something new. Now, this is often the part of a myth of a great man of history. Whether or not it actually happened, this is something that's often attributed to one. When Hannibal Barca was a child, he had begged his father to take him to a battle, and his father said, I'll take you, but you have to swear to forever be the enemy of Rome, which he did. We have Martin Luther, Here I Stand, I Can Do No Other, and Simón Bolivar when he pledged to free Latin America from Spanish rule. So Reinhardt had his own oath in which he set out kind of the course the rest of his life. So soon after the oath, Reinhardt entered the military academy. He graduated top of his class and began a career in the military shaped by the belief that power must be seized through force of arms, and it was the only real form of social mobility within the Galactic Empire, and that's kind of a bit of a stretch, but you could get at least somewhat high up. You could make it to like the low admiralty, even if the top spots were reserved for the senior nobility. So, once again, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is 100 episodes, a prequel, and multiple movies, so we're just going to summarize Reinhardt's career as much as possible. So, very early on, he displayed near supernatural command abilities, and this combined with the Kaiser's favoritism because of Annerose, he rapidly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a fleet admiral, which is basically a field marshal, and an imperial count. It was only a couple of years. It was one of the fastest rises to the rank of admiral. I think he was probably the youngest. Interestingly enough, the aging hedonistic Kaiser seemed aware of Reinhardt's ambitions, but continued promoting him anyway. And crucially, he never designated an heir, ensuring that there was going to be a future succession crisis. Now, there's some evidence in it that he knew this was going to happen, and he just wanted to burn down his dynasty as kind of something of a practical joke. So he may very well have known that Reinhardt was probably going to be the one to succeed him. And so he kept giving him power, both politically and militarily. And when he died, he left him in the position he needed to be in. So along his rise, Reinhardt gathered a coterie of talented young officers, the most notable being Reuenthal, Mittermeier, and Oberstein. And they mostly either came from commoner or lower noble backgrounds and were all disillusioned with the system. These were three of the most skilled people of their age. Reuenthal and Mittermeier are probably in the top 5 military commanders in the series, and Oberstein was a master bureaucrat, intelligence officer, chief of staff. What really kind of it reminds me of is Napoleon's marshals. Napoleon gathered together this brain trust of just amazing commander after amazing commander. And he was able to just put them all together and raise the Grande Armée and just kind of overrun everything in his path with all of these brilliant men. And it's not quite the same thing, but it does kind of remind me of it, like forming the dream team, as it were. So, as other imperial commanders basically just continually screwed it up and were unable to get results, Reinhardt kept winning battle after battle, and he was eventually appointed vice commander of the Imperial Space Fleet and given control of the army that was fighting the Alliance, who had just invaded Imperial space after Yang had taken Iserlohn. After winning a major victory against the Free Planet Alliance and suing for peace, Reinhardt received word that the Kaiser had died, and with there being no adult heir and him not designating one, a succession crisis erupted. He had grandkids, and there was the sons of his daughters and that kind of thing, but there wasn't an adult male heir who had specifically been chosen. And so the throne was very much up for grabs. So Reinhardt moved extremely quickly. As I said, he was in command of the Empire's main field army, and he rushed back to Odin and seized power and arrested a lot of his political adversaries. In cooperation with the Prime Minister, he installed the child Emperor Erwin Joseph II as the puppet emperor, which effectively split the empire in two between Reinhardt and his supporters and the high nobility, who would not permit an upstart, lower class, golden brat who only gained power because his sister was sleeping with the former emperor run the Galactic Empire. So this strongly echoes Napoleon's return from Egypt and his seizure of power during the Directorate's collapse. Like Napoleon, Reinhardt didn't immediately crown himself. He did take power. In particular, he called himself Prime Minister and Supreme Commander and held both roles. So he held supreme military and civil power, but he left Erwin Joseph II on the throne and acted as his regent. This is very common throughout history when, particularly with mothers, when their husbands dies and their young child inherits, they will become regent and basically just rule the kingdom on their behalf. And the more nefarious ones will kill or otherwise remove their child or whoever it is, their grandchild, before they come of age and replace them with another minor, and just kind of keep doing an endless stream of those to hold power indefinitely despite not having a legal claim to the throne. So the Civil War was extremely quick, largely because the Noble League made one really good decision in which they appointed one of my favorite characters, High Admiral Merkatz, to lead the League nobility. And Merkatz was like, okay, I will accept this, but you have to give me complete control of the Navy, complete freedom of command, and not interfere. And they're like, yeah, we 100% agree. And you know what happened? They didn't stick to that. They ignored everything Merkatz said. They said he was too cautious, that his advice to not charge blindly with no intel was a bad idea. And the war ended pretty quick. Oberstein also got the nobility to nuke a planet, which alienated most of the lesser nobility and public opinion. Unfortunately, though, Kircheis died at the end of the war, and Annerose, kind of depressed by the whole situation, withdrew into seclusion. So Reinhardt was left utterly alone with no one who really knew him. Like, he had people he would probably consider friends or peers or people he could have a conversation with. But the people who knew about him before he was the golden brat, before he was this messianic figure, were all gone from his life at this point. And so with all the high nobility wiped out, and the puppet emperor on the throne, Reinhardt wielded a degree of autocratic power that hadn't been seen since Rudolf first established the Galactic Empire. So to me, what really stands out is how effortless a lot of this has. Now, not to take anything away from Reinhardt, he's a brilliant military commander, a brilliant statesman, and is always one step ahead of his opponents. But a lot of things just kind of fell into place. Had the Kaiser actually cared about his dynasty and executed him, that would have stopped him. The Kaiser could have done that at any point in time. Yang constantly tried to give advice to the alliance leadership, who ignored him. Like I said, the nobles not allowing mercats to actually win the war, run the war, or any number of other just kind of convenient things happened that kind of smoothed his way to power. And Reinhardt is very aware of this, and it becomes part of his existential crisis later on in the series as to how much of this he actually achieved on his own merit, and how much destiny just thrust upon him. So, upon gaining power, Reinhardt implemented sweeping reforms. He seized the assets of the rebel nobles, most of the high nobles in the kingdom. That resolved all the empire's finances. I'd imagine that the government owed a lot of money to those people, so they didn't have to pay that money anymore. Serfdom ended, fiefs were revoked, traditional aristocratic privileges more or less disappeared. I think in some cases people were allowed to keep their titles, although that may have been a specific arrangement because Hilda and her group backed Reinhardt during the Civil War. However, as with Napoleon, Reinhardt still does believe in hierarchy. He believes in the greater people ruling over the lesser people. And what he wanted to do was to replace the system of hereditary rule with a more meritocratic system. So people still got titles, and they still got some privileges of being nobles, but these were doled out in return for service to the state, particularly in the context of the military. It probably resembled something like Russia's table of ranks, which, if I understand it, once you reached a certain level in the military or civil service, you automatically became a noble for the duration of your life. And if you reached a certain rank, it would become permanent and hereditary for the rest of your family. I do wonder if his empire had continued and he had ruled longer, if maybe they wouldn't have adopted something like the Chinese civil service exam system that in theory would give everybody the option to rise in the empire. Because that's kind of the problem I have, is it's always nice to say we're going to pick the best people, it's going to be a meritocracy, but the empire is a big place, and Reinhardt's one guy who controls everything basically personally. So is he really going to appoint every single governor, every single minister, deputy minister, the head of the Imperial Environmental Protection Association? They're going to have some way to deal with this. Reinhardt isn't going to have just random people he knew when he was in the military forever. And so, yeah, we never really got an answer to that. To be fair, he didn't have a ton of time to put it in, but I just do find that an interesting aspect of his reign. Aside from that, Reinhardt ruled as pretty much a classic textbook enlightened despot. That referred to absolute monarchs from the Enlightenment who, despite being absolute monarchs, wanted to be modern and show how well educated they were, so they would adopt aspects of Enlightenment thinking while maintaining the absolute monarchy. So Reinhardt reformed the legal code. There was a universal legal code. Administration was rationalized. We don't know too much, but I think public services were improved. Taxes were more fair. The police state that existed during the Golden Bomb dynasty was massively scaled back, and limited freedom of speech and the press were introduced. Now, what happens sometimes in autocratic governments is there will be freedom to talk about things like policies. So if you want to talk about like the free market versus a command economy, if you want to talk about different schemes for healthcare or something like that, that's generally permitted. And in some cases, like with Russia or China, they will basically set up fake opposition parties in part so that you have different perspectives who can offer ideas. So, of course, the irony of this whole thing, and this is what happened with absolute monarchs and enlightened despots in real life, despite all these improvements, the quality of life, despite the lower classes being freer than ever, power was now completely centralized in the position of the emperor. There's no nobility really anymore to counterbalance him. And he ruled directly through a loyal bureaucracy. So, Operation Ragnarok. So, echoing William I of Prussia, being crowned emperor in Versailles after the Franco-Prussian War, Reinhardt chose to complete the conquest of the galaxy before taking the throne himself, leaving the Kaiser Erwin Joseph II on the throne, although he gets kidnapped at one point and they find like an even younger little girl to take his place. Once again, it's very obvious that they're just a puppet at this point in time, but Reinhardt doesn't feel that he's ready yet to declare himself Kaiser. He has to win this great victory. He has to prove not just to the empire, but to himself that he's worthy of ruling all of humanity. So this is Operation Ragnarok, or the final defeat of the Free Planets Alliance, the other superpower in the Legend of the Galactic Heroes universe. So the galaxy, as you can see down here, is divided basically into half, or maybe not quite half, but there's only two real, I don't know what it's called in here, phase lanes, light speed lanes, warp lanes that connect the two halves of the galaxy. We have Iserlon, which at this point in time was in the hands of Yang, and we have Phazon, which was an autonomous imperial vassal who was infamous for playing both sides against each other in a way to maintain its independence. Reinhardt came to the conclusion that if he was going to rule united humanity, he couldn't do it from Odin. He needed a more centralized location. So Phase 1 of Operation Ragnarok was, by complete surprise, seizing Phazon, declaring it the imperial capital, and starting to move the administration of the empire there. So the alliance had just been through a civil war and a military junta. They had failed multiple invasions to drastic effect, and the empire has a higher population and more ships to begin with. So all they were able to really scrape together to try to stop Reinhardt was 33,000 ships, many of them from planetary militias or were about to be decommissioned. Up against this, Reinhardt had 113,000, so they were vastly outnumbered. Despite this, Admiral Bucock, the leader of the Alliance fleet, fought very valiantly and did a lot of damage to the Imperial forces considering how outgunned he was. Fortunately, though, Yang showed up at the last minute to save the remnants from annihilation. So, enter Yang Wen-li. Now, Yang is in many ways the mirror image of Reinhardt. I think he's likely the only person who Reinhardt saw as being his true equal. As I said, even though he loved Kircheis, he was never an equal in the relationship. He was never quite as smart as Reinhardt, quite as skilled as him. And in Yang, he found someone who was probably a better military commander than he was. And honestly, if he wanted to, Yang could probably become as skilled a politician as Reinhardt was. He just really had no interest in it. So Reinhardt, like I said, has very conflicted feelings towards Yang. Part of him wanted Yang to replace that Kircheis-sized hole in his heart, for him to become his new best friend, someone he could confide in. Another part of him wanted a decisive battle against Yang, where they just went up against each other, the best man would win. He would either kill Yang or he would die at Yang's hands. Reinhardt is fundamentally a romantic, and the idea of dying to the one man he considered his equal appealed to him a lot. Also, if he could beat Yang, also known as Miracle Yang, that would prove to himself that it was not a mistake, it was not just destiny, that he was as good as he thought he was, and that he was truly worthy to run the galaxy. So I'll have to do a video on Yang at some point, because he's probably my favorite character. So Yang, like I said, was probably a better military commander actually than Reinhardt. And we get little glimpses of it that he probably could have been a very skilled politician had he wanted to. Yang, however, is a humble and somewhat lazy man who despises war. The only reason he actually joined the military was to get their version of the GI Bill that would pay for him to study history in university. Yang always wanted to be a historian, maybe a history professor, and that was his goal in life. That was the height of his ambition. Despite his immense military skills, he repeatedly tries to retire, as he has a very humanist perspective. And unlike a lot of people in this series, so something I notice a lot with the Imperial commanders is even the ones who do care about their men on some level, who are decent people like Mittermeier, at the same time don't really act in a way that tries to preserve the lives of their troops. Like, they'll just launch like YOLO big offensives into highly defensible positions and win through bloody attritional warfare without really a second thought. And they'll do stuff like not withdrawing when they should because of their honor, or we need to stand and die and not surrender because of honor, or stuff like that. And Yang is very much not like that. He sees his men as men, and he tries to minimize their losses whenever possible. And he does believe if he's going to sacrifice them, they have to be sacrificed for a greater purpose, as part of like a bigger strategy that would actually turn the war around. And while he was extremely good at war, you got the impression that Yang didn't really enjoy it. Reinhardt, however, lived for battle. And I think at a certain level, Reinhardt probably envied this about Yang. While Reinhardt conquered the galaxy, and that was his dream, Yang's dream was to raise a family with Friederike, write history books, and die in peace in his bed surrounded by his wife and children. Hopefully his history would remember him as a great historian, and his books would carry on for generations. But if not, Yang didn't really care. He would have achieved everything he wanted to in life and died content. So I think at a certain level, he might have envied Yang's ability to just take that perspective. So Reinhardt is always driven to constantly test himself. In many ways, winning was worse than losing because it eliminated one more challenge, one more potential obstacle for him to overcome. When he eventually defeated everyone and there were no more challenges left, he was kind of left adrift. He became depressed. This happens numerous times in the series. And I find a continual theme is this desire of Reinhardt to not die of old age, to not die of disease, to not even really spend the rest of his life ruling over the galaxy, but to die in battle against a man he could truly respect. So, during the Operation Ragnarok, we have Reinhardt's worst victory. So Yang had escaped with what little was left of the Alliance fleet, and he realized that there was no way he could actually beat the Empire, and the only way that he could come up with to defeat them was that Reinhardt had no heir or designated successor. So if he was able to kill Reinhardt, the Empire would fall apart and there'd be a civil war, or they would lack the morale to continue on. So Yang basically just started launching a hit and run campaign, destroying isolated pockets of the Imperial fleet, taking out supply dumps, and the Imperial fleet had to disperse and try to be everywhere at once to try to protect itself from Yang's asymmetric warfare. Now, the purpose of this was to lure the fleet away, as much of the fleet away as possible from Reinhardt and the core fleet around him, so he would have enough, the balance of forces would be just enough that Yang could hopefully scrape a victory out of it. Now, Reinhardt knew he was doing this because it was pretty obvious. However, Yang bet on the fact that Reinhardt is a romantic, and could not resist the idea of having this one-on-one duel with Yang to decide everything. And that's exactly what happened. And this was the only direct battle between Yang and Reinhardt over the course of their lives and both of their careers, despite having so much impact on each other's life. So Yang won. He succeeded in accomplishing his military objective. He managed to blow his way through Reinhardt's fleet. His ship came right up to Reinhardt's ship, and he was about to fire when an order came in for Yang to stand down, as Hilda, Mittermeier, and Reuenthal had kind of bypassed the Yang fleet and had directly attacked the capital and were holding the government hostage, and they forced Yang to surrender. Yang believes, if nothing else, in democracy and in civilian control of the military, so much to the chagrin of his followers, he decided to stand down and not kill Reinhardt when he got the chance. For Reinhardt, this was probably the most traumatic experience of his life, and he says, even when I lose, I win. Because he had definitively lost against Yang. Yang had completely outplayed him, outmatched him, but then fate intervened to save him. And now he has to live with the knowledge that his one victory against the man who he considered to be his equal ended because of some external factor. After the battle, once again hoping to fill that Kircheis-sized shaped hole in his heart, Reinhardt asked Yang to join him and give him the title of Fleet Admiral. At this point in time, I think there was only 3 Fleet Admirals, so that would be an extremely high position in the imperial military. Yang said, though, no, I want to retire with my wife, raise a family, and just spend my days reading history books. He basically said, well, one good thing about this war is because I got promoted a bunch, my pension's going to be a lot higher. And that is the way Yang thinks, and I think to a certain extent, Reinhardt kind of envies that. So we have a rematch. Operation Ragnarok 2 Electric Boogaloo. So after the first Operation Ragnarok, the Empire had surrendered, and Reinhardt didn't think it was quite ready to annex into the Empire, so he set it up as basically a satellite state that maintained a considerable degree of autonomy, but was not allowed to have a significant army and would eventually be absorbed into the Empire. So a bunch of shenanigans happened. We're not going to go into it, but Reinhardt launched Operation Ragnarok 2. We have one of my favorite battles of the series where Admiral Bucock came out of retirement again and led the last remnants of the Alliance fleet. He only allowed people 40 years or older to come with him because it was a suicide mission. And he picked a very narrow, phase lane or warp lane in the middle of an asteroid field, which he also planted mines in. So he was able to negate a lot of the advantage that the Empire had, because he was outnumbered 5-1, and he wound up inflicting more casualties than he took. He had like 20,000 ships, and he inflicted like 35,000 casualties, which was extremely impressive. This was one of the few moments in Reinhardt's life you can see he was genuinely moved. Though he didn't agree with republicanism or democracy, Reinhardt is a man of honor. He sees himself as a knight, and the fact that Bucock was willing to go into battle knowing he was about to die, and to stand firm, to stay calm, to continue to just perform above and beyond what was expected in a dire situation. After winning the battle and killing Bucock, in a very unusual gesture, Reinhardt ordered all the Imperial ships to salute him as a mark of respect for the man's sacrifice and his courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Normally the Empire would mock or make fun or look down on their opponents, so this was a very rare honor to be given. At the same time, though, Reinhardt would probably come to regret this to a certain extent, as it became clear later on that his illness was terminal and he really wanted somebody worthy to kill him. While Bucock is not Yang or Julian or even Reuenthal, he is an honorable man, and he is the kind of person who I think Reinhardt would be okay dying to. After Bucock's defeat, there was literally nothing left. Yang was holed up in Iserlohn with a couple remaining troops. The Free Planet Alliance was annexed almost in its entirety, and he gave his friend and protege, Admiral Oscar Reuenthal, the position as governor of the former Alliance territories. So, like a third to 40% of the galaxy was just given to this guy. This guy who Reinhardt had previously said, if you think you can beat me, if you think you can take my throne, go ahead and try. And so he gave an immense fleet, all these resources, and all this territory to this guy who he had goaded in the past and who he, I think, knew had ambitions. So I do wonder if he was setting him up to kind of be the next rival, the next kind of great power that he would be able to struggle against. With all enemies defeated, all power centralized into him personally, Reinhardt grew bored really quick. Unlike Napoleon, he showed very little interest in governance beyond his initial reforms. Reinhardt comes across outside of command or statecraft as being relatively emotionally immature. Outside of war, he really has no hobbies or interests, and he tries out a bunch of different cultural pursuits and immediately gets bored from them. In social settings, he was awkward, shy, and unsure of really how to relate to other people. In this contrast with Napoleon, now Napoleon, to use the cliche, was a true Renaissance man. He was someone who, if ever Napoleon would hear about something new, he would immediately have to know about it. If he heard about some new math formula, if he heard about some new scientific discovery, some history thing he hadn't heard about, he would immediately call in an expert or he'd read a book about it, and he was an immensely curious man. Beyond that, Napoleon was known for his tireless work ethic, hands-on management style. He was intimately involved with pretty much every aspect of his empire, and in many cases he left his personal stamp on it. Now obviously Reinhardt's empire is much bigger, but I just don't get that vibe from him at all, that he's not kind of interested in the counting coppers or the paperwork aspect of governance. So similar to Augustus, Tokugawa, or Bismarck, Napoleon wanted to build a coherent, enduring system that would outlast him. So that involved revising laws, tax systems, and currency. Reinhardt, for all his brilliance, never truly institutionalized his vision. Well, he made some of these reforms. I'm not really sure how much they took and how much he tried to build something coherent that would last past his death. He probably didn't even really care about it. Reinhardt really didn't show much interest in founding a dynasty at all. Whenever people would tell him to get married and have an heir, he would kind of brush it off as unimportant. He's very much like Alexander the Great, well, in a lot of regards, but Alexander the Great said, "I leave my kingdom to the strongest." And that was very much how Reinhardt was, and he would even goad people or tell them, if you think you're better than me, then come and take it. Even when later on he had a son, I really feel like he had zero enthusiasm for Alexander Siegfried to inherit the throne after him. I feel like really the only reason he declared him his heir and tried to do the bare minimum to set him up is out of affection for Hilda. But he even tells her, if my son is a loser, then don't let him run the empire. So, speaking of that, let's talk about Hilda, or Hildegard von Mariendorf. So she was a very ambitious and highly intelligent woman, very atypical for the very conservative empire. She wasn't interested in like dresses or parties or flowers or all that stuff. She was more interested in military and political affairs. At the outset of the Civil War, she approached Reinhardt on the belief that he was going to win and said she represented a group of middle nobility who were willing to back Reinhardt if their lands would be guaranteed and they could keep them after the war, to which he agreed. She was just so articulate and intelligent, he immediately was taken with her. I don't think romantically, but he liked her. He thought that she was someone he could actually talk to. Maybe she wasn't quite as smart as him, but she was better than 99% of people he had met. So he took her on as his personal secretary, and she became his most trusted advisor for the remainder of his life. At one point serving as chief of the general staff for the Imperial Starfleet. So The thing about Hilda is she was the one who took. Remember, we talked about the Battle of Vermilion, where Reinhardt lost but then won because the alliance government told Yang to step down. That was actually her idea. She had convinced Mittermeier and Reuenthal to go along with her and just bypass out like the various Yang fleet and attack the capital directly, hold the alliance government hostage, and force them to surrender. I do wonder, though, if to a certain extent Reinhardt resented her for that, as it denied him the death he had always sought at the hands of the man, who he saw as his equal. She was the only real contender for the role of empress. There really wasn't any other female that Reinhardt had ever even really talked to, other than her and his sister. And I don't know if incest is permitted in the empire, but she just wasn't kind of interested in being the mistress of another Kaiser. So it was down to Hildegard, but she was a strong, independent woman. She liked her career. She liked holding power. She didn't want to become a ornamental toy for Reinhardt. So in a moment of depression, Reinhardt had slept with her, and it's really funny because he's horrified the next day. He's like, "Oh no, I dishonored her," and he like goes to his father and like begs him to let him marry his daughter, and he's like, "I dishonored your daughter. I defiled her. Please let me make an honest woman out of her." And it's just really like out of character for him. Hilda declined to marry him, but didn't say no. She said, "I'm going to have to think about it." However, after she discovered eventually that she was pregnant from their night together, she decided that she would accept Reinhardt's proposal and became empress. So their marriage was very short. I can't recall if it was like a year or so. I think his son was born almost directly before his death. So we never really got to see them develop that much. But once they got married, it was clear Reinhardt's illness was getting worse and was likely terminal. While he did have an affection for her, he did care about her as well as he could care about anybody. He was never really able to open up to her in the way that he had with Kircheis or Annerose. In many ways, the loss of those two seemed to have extinguished the last traces of emotional vulnerability in him. This, combined with the anticlimactic death of Yang, left Reinhardt incapable of forming any real emotional bonds with anyone. His marriage seemed driven more by duty and the desire to not disappoint the people who had supported him, rather than any real desire for companionship or basic male desire for a woman. I mean, not that Reinhardt didn't like women, but he wasn't like a very lusty, amorous person by nature. Although, once again, he was terminally ill at this point in time, so that might have played some role in it. So perhaps in another world, a better world in which Reinhardt's sister had never been taken away, where him and Kircheis had been able to go off together and seek their destiny without the bitterness and resentment that Reinhardt became consumed by. Maybe in that world, Kircheis could have married Annerose after the Kaiser died, and maybe Reinhardt could have met Hilda under different circumstances and married her, and they could have had a happy marriage like Yang and Friederike did, where it was built on unconditional trust and a mutual genuine understanding of each other. Yang and Friederike's relationship is very cute. After they like formally get together, Friederike pretty much always calls him darling or some other term of endearment. And like I said, I think they would have been very good parents had they had children. So this leads to the Battle of the Corridor, where Yang had retreated to Iserlohn Fortress, the last bastion of democracy. So Reinhardt was hoping for his final showdown where he could finally defeat Yang, or Yang could kill him, and their strange tied destinies could be resolved one way or another. Yang, once again outnumbered 5-1, this should feel familiar by this point, was able to force a brutal stalemate. In terms of just being a slugfest, with extremely high casualties and neither side gaining a decisive advantage, this is probably the single most brutal battle, at least in my opinion, in this series. So it was more or less at A stalemate. Reinhardt collapsed from his illness, and he had a dream where Kircheis came to him and urged him to befriend his greatest enemy and to seek out peace in coexistence. So he contacted Yang and offered him peace negotiations, which Yang, of course, accepted because he was kind of running on empty. In fact, his forces were so tired by the end of the battle, most of them didn't even make it back to their bunks. And you just have this kind of funny scene where you just have Yang's like entire fleet, like all of his sailors and soldiers just kind of collapsed on the floor, sleeping wherever they fell. So Yang left Iserlohn to go to meet with Reinhardt for the peace negotiations. However, on the way there, Yang was assassinated by terrorist agents. And yes, that is a funny pun. En route, and he died without having ever been defeated by Reinhardt. So Reinhardt was denied closure. He never got to be Yang's BFF. He never got to face him in a final duel that would have given them a meaningful end. As a side note, given Yang's kind of disdain for romantic interpretations of history, I could see his death amusing him greatly, that the great miracle Yang died not in battle, but cut down outside of the battlefield in a senseless act of violence. So a big series of ops were carried out by the terrorists that basically framed Reuenthal for trying to launch a coup and take control of the empire from Reinhardt. However, rather than going and explaining himself and saying the terrorists were behind it and this whole thing was like a big op, Reuenthal decided that he was going to make his play now. A mixture of ego, fatalism, cynicism, and feeling that he was trapped, and that if he went to try to give his side of the story, Oberstein would kill him before he could even get to Reinhardt. He launched his uprising. The rebellion was very short. It only had a single battle in which Reuenthal was fatally wounded at the hands of his best friend, Mittermeier. So this was another betrayal for Reinhardt. This was another person he considered a friend and someone who he could have an intelligent conversation with. And not only had the guy left him, but he had also betrayed him. And so this brings us to the Battle of Shiva. Now, by this point, Reinhardt's condition continues to get worse and worse. We are never given an exact illness. I would imagine that it's some sort of genetic or autoimmune disease that's just very hard to diagnose properly and treat. It may be one of those rare genetic defects that only like 1 in 10 million people have, and so doctors never really have the opportunity or the need to study it. Anyway, so a bunch of other stuff happened. There was a revolt in the former Alliance territory, and Julian, who was Yang's adopted son and protege, who had been made military commander after he died despite his young age, decided that this was their chance. That they were going to go out and fight Reinhardt. They were probably going to lose. They were vastly outnumbered. They didn't even have enough men to man all of their ships. But this was going to be the best chance that they were going to get, and they couldn't abandon the rebels who were fighting for democracy against the empire, or else their whole cause would just look like a complete and total joke. Basically, Julian just said, look, we're all going to die probably doing this, so if you think this is something worth dying for, you can come with me. If you don't, then you can leave. Kind of like what Bucock did back in a previous war where he said the same thing to his men. So at this point, Reinhardt realized this was going to be his final battle, either because this was his last remaining enemy, and once this was done, all the loose ends would be tied up if he won, or it would be his last battle because he was terminally ill. So Reinhardt decided to take direct command of this battle. Once again, it's the last battle he would command directly. Generally speaking, he would normally entrust his various fleet commanders and subordinates to carry out the battle, whereas he would only kind of intervene when necessary. So Julian is very skilled. Now, he's young, he's inexperienced, but he learned from Yang very extensively. He's very intelligent, and he's very adaptable. So is he on the level of someone like Mittermeier? No. but he is very effective for his age, and his opponent was basically dying and was continually collapsing and utterly delirious. Reinhardt stubbornly refused to transfer command of the battle to Mittermeier or someone else who could definitively win it. Mittermeier went over to be with his emperor. So the imperial fleet was basically leaderless and directionless. Julian saw his chance. He decided to do what Yang had done at the previous battle, and he was going to go after Reinhardt. Not to kill him, because at this point he had an heir, and it would be kind of pointless, and it's just not really the ideals that Julian espoused. He wanted to go to Reinhardt, look him face in the eye like a man, and make his demands, and speak to him as an equal. And he managed to succeed. It reminds me a lot of like Andrew Ryan, or like when the villain is just doesn't bother to try to escape. They're just there waiting for the hero to come and kill them or whatever. And Reinhardt just said, like, this is a man who is facing me because he believes so much in republicanism and democracy and human rights, who's willing to die, who's willing to go himself into the gates of hell, who's willing to go on and do this insane attack on the enemy flagship in a battle where he's severely outnumbered. And Reinhardt expects that. He respects that Julian has courage, conviction, and frankly the balls to pull off something like this. So he just says, look, if Julian can get to me, then he can do whatever he wants. And he doesn't say it to Mittermeier, but I do think on some level, once again, he would have liked it if Julian had have killed him. Because once again, he's someone who's not like a scumbag. He's not corrupt. He's not like the nobility that he so despised. He liked Julian. I think ultimately he saw a lot of Yang, Kircheis, and even some of himself in him, and he kind of saw in him the seeds of the next generation. So Julian made it to him, and he demanded that they negotiate autonomy for at least part of the alliance. And he said, I want the empire has to adopt a constitution. So after making those demands, Julian fell over. Reinhardt immediately saw that he received medical aid and called an end to the battle. As to what the terms would ultimately be, Reinhardt said, that will be left up to Hilda, as I'm not going to live much longer. And we have a couple of scenes of them talking on the way back to Faison. So Reinhardt was able to limp back to Faison and reluctantly and ironically named his son Alexander Siegfried, Kircheis' first name is Siegfried, as his heir, appointing Hilda as regent. He told her that if his son proved to be a loser, she should abandon the throne. She should make him abandon the throne and give it to whoever was the strongest. Once again, there's kind of a certain irony to that. The myth is that when Alexander the Great was dying, he said, I leave my empire to the strongest. He named his son Alexander, and he said, if someone's stronger than my son, then he can take the throne. Ultimately, he just left the entire future of the empire in the hands of his wife. Once again, like I said, he never really had a coherent plan or ideology for how he wanted things to be. And he saw Hilda as someone who had a lot more vision and was much better at that sort of thing. So he just said, you can keep the autocracy, you can adopt a constitution, you can do whatever you want. I fulfilled my role. I conquered the galaxy, I united humanity, and now I die. And so after an extremely long, complex lifetime of struggle, up to 10 years, Reinhardt passed the torch to the next generation at the age of 25, having reigned for all of 2 years. I mean, 25 is getting up there. He has to pass the torch. So epilogue. As to what became of Reinhardt's empire, who can say? Given that Hilda was generally liberal, I think it's safe to say the empire adopted some sort of constitution and an elected assembly. However, how the balance of power between the emperor and assembly worked out, with the emperor maybe holding executive but not legislative power, who can say? The story leaves the future deliberately unresolved, because history never truly ends and no tale is ever truly finished. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation will get more than 2 years on the throne and may even reach their 30s before they're considered relics of a bygone era. So, legacy. Reinhardt was in many ways the ultimate great man. He appeared at precisely the right moment in history and, propelled by near supernatural talent and the weight of destiny, rose from obscurity to unite all of humanity. Within just 6 years of becoming an admiral, he accomplished more in less time than perhaps any other figure in human history. Rudolf, you could argue, accomplished more, but he lived a lot longer than Reinhardt did. Some great men are destined to change the world fundamentally and perhaps even conquer it, but not to rule it. Men like Julius Caesar, Simon Bolivar, Aurelian, and of course Alexander the Great either died shortly after taking power or had very brief reigns, but got a lot of things done. At the same time, though, perhaps it's best that Reinhardt died when he did. He was spared the curse of living too long, watching his achievements unravel and his legend corrode. He was able to end on a high note, having conquered the entirety of the galaxy, being seen as this great reformer. Who knows, maybe things would have just fallen apart over time due to his disinterest. Maybe some of the more people would have snaked on him. Maybe he would have become emotionally unstable. Who really knows? I always like when we talk about this to refer to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who came to power and saved the Byzantine Empire from a cataclysmic war with the Persians. And had he died after that, he probably would be remembered as arguably the greatest Byzantine emperor. But he lived too long, and he saw like a large portion of the empire being taken away by the Arabs, and so his record went from like being one of the all-time best to being mixed to poor. And so we come back to the question we started off with. Who is Reinhardt? Well, we saw over 100 episodes, multiple movies, an entire prequel series, and Reinhardt remains to a certain degree an enigma, perhaps to no one more so than himself. And that's a theme in the series. He's never entirely sure who he was. So who was Reinhardt? Was he an idealist, a progressive and a reformer who genuinely wanted a better galaxy? Was he a narcissist? Was his entire honorable, chivalrous personality just a narcissistic front in order to get people to love him and to enshrine his own legend? Maybe he was someone who was fundamentally empty, that the real war was within him, and he sought to fill the emptiness through struggle, victory, and proving himself against his opponents. Or perhaps deep down he was still the little boy in the locket, longing for another world, one free from ambition, where he could simply live out in his life in peace with his best friend, his sister, and probably Hilda as well. The most likely truth, though, is that he was all these things and more. A man of such overwhelming will and capacity defies easy classification, and perhaps can't be fully understood by those lesser than himself. Regardless of what else he was, Reinhard von Lohengramm was a great man who changed the course of the galaxy forever. Because as we know, with all great men, history is a symptom of their disease. I hope you enjoyed this character profile of Reinhardt. It took a really long time to make if you made it to the end. God bless, thank you. Hopefully I didn't stutter too much. So I'll talk to you guys again real soon.